Good to see you. Well, let's begin with a silent meditation for a little bit. Okay. I'd like to begin by just taking a few minutes to kind of survey what I'd like to cover in this webinar about spiritual practice. I'd like to spend some time on both of the main aspects of spiritual practice, both the inner side, the meditative, and kind of more internal aspect of practice, and of course the integration of spiritual practice in daily life. As far as inner practices, there's quite a variety, and so I'd like to come at that from two different angles. One is to explore a variety of practices, because in my experience of working with people over the years, I've found that people respond differently to different practices. People have different types of, their character is different, their character traits, their karmic history, and in fact, their stage of development all varies from person to person. And so different practices don't always appeal to people in the same way or have the same effect. And so for a variety of those kinds of reasons, which we'll explore in greater depth, it's good to be exposed to various kinds of practices, even at times when we feel that practice that we're working with is really appropriate or seems to be working fine for us. Sometimes discovering some new approach can be powerful. So part of this course will be a kind of survey of several key main styles of meditative practice, and not just from the angle of tasting these different approaches, but also working to develop an understanding of what's different about each practice and what its strengths and limitations are, and what kinds of people or in what kinds of situations will a given practice be particularly useful or appropriate, and in what situations may it be not ideal, or in fact might work to cause an increased imbalance, for instance, in a person. So as part of our survey, we'll look at these kind of factors, and at the same time, I want to cultivate a growing appreciation for what is common to all forms of spiritual practice, whether they're internal or those that we engage in during our day-to-day lives. Because part of our own spiritual development and awakening is discovering this inner essence that is not only common to our various kinds of practice, but also fundamental to our own experience. We're really discovering something that is core or underlying or universal within ourselves. So understanding how that's reflected in practice also impacts our own sense of ourselves, our own experience of that essential nature that is underlying in all of us. So that's another key dimension of what I'd like to explore is kind of revealing that common essence and thread. In fact, one of the things that I've been developing over the years is a kind of anatomy of spiritual practice, you might say, a way of looking at any given practice, for instance, and kind of understanding the components that make it up. And this helps us to understand better the nature of that practice. And it also helps us understand ways that we can deepen and mature that practice, and what its strengths and limitations are. Now, picking up this thread of the common element, one place I'd like to start with that is suggesting that one essential way to look at spiritual development in general and what's going on in any form of spiritual practice is the development of, for lack of a better word, I'll simply call intuition. Now, I'm defining intuition in a very specific way here because this term really has a lot of applications. People will use the term intuition to mean a lot of things. It's very common for intuition, in fact, to simply mean instinct. Very often, especially when people who aren't particularly spiritually inclined use the word intuition, they just mean a less rational way of understanding something, which is very often more simply means emotion or instinct or something more feeling based. At other times, people use the word intuition to mean being psychic. An intuitive often means somebody who is psychically sensitive, and this is also not exactly what I mean by intuition. In other instances, we find that individuals will use the word intuition in their own specific way, like, for instance, Aurobindo used the term intuition to describe a very specific type of consciousness that was kind of in between, somewhere in between, excuse me, ordinary reason and intellect and what he called supermind. It was one of the sort of layers of subdivisions of type of consciousness, and it's closer to what in some traditions is called higher mind. And again, this is a different usage of the word intuition. So let's take a moment to clarify what I mean by intuition then. The first aspect that helps to understand the nature of intuition is that and to clarify what I mean is that very often people mean something that's primarily a way of knowing, something cognitive. It might be beyond reason, but still often is used in a way that is primarily a mode of understanding. And what I want to suggest is that intuition in its fuller sense is both receptive in sense of like a way of knowing, but it's also active. There's an active aspect of intuition, an expressive aspect. So it's balanced in that way. It's not simply a state of perception or understanding. Another dimension of intuition that is part of the way I define it is that it's a deeply holistic way of knowing. When you know through intuition, it's not so much experienced in its fuller, deeper form as a kind of sense of you being a separate person, having some kind of knowledge about something or somebody that's primarily sensed to be outside of yourself. Like the intellect works in a way where we sort of build a model inside of our mind, like an image, or it's like we build a sort of replica of what we think a person is. It's like we build an image of them, and we have different experiences of them. We kind of fill in this model that we're building in our minds. Science is a perfect example of this way. Science goes about gathering sensory data. It's like the world is out there, so you gather data, and then you use a methodology to kind of use that to figure out a way to build an internal model that's trying to be a sort of a replica of how things are outside of yourself. So there's a real gap there in the sense that you're trying to use this, special technique to bridge the gap. Like there's a world out there. I'm going to do a lot of fancy things to try to make an internal model of what's out there and make that model as accurate as possible. Most human knowledge, in one way or another, whether we're thinking about it in those terms or not, is that style. Intuition is fundamentally different than that. It's a very it's not only a very holistic way of knowing, but it's based on an ability to commune with that which is being known, and in a sense kind of attune and resonate with that reality, that person, that object, that being, and to know. One metaphor that perhaps is useful is that sort of intuition is more like making our consciousness into a mirror in which the reality that we're seeking to know can directly reflect itself in its own nature. We're not trying to build a model of that and try to become more accurate in knowing. We're trying to attune and commune with in a deeper way and know through that kind of deeper sympathy, a resonance. In fact, the heights of intuition, we merge with the object that we wish to know, and we know it by being it. So, whether it's the cultivation of a sense of the interconnectedness of things, or it's an experience of communing with God, or it's an experience of a sense of oneness with nature, or it's a deepening of various spiritual qualities like peace, or love, or wisdom. All of these experiences are based on intuition. Intuition is the mode of being that we're cultivating in order to have any of these kinds of spiritual experiences. It's the common thread. Now, in some systems, there are notions that there are forms of consciousness beyond intuition, kind of like a hierarchy of different modes of knowing, like senses. A common one that many of us are familiar with is the body and its senses and organs of action, at that level, or our emotional nature, our mental and intellectual nature. And then intuition is like the next stage beyond that. And without going into much about that right at the moment, I'm going to just comment briefly that there's a way in which I can resonate with that point of view about it. At the same time, for me, intuition is actually something deeper still. It's not one of several stages in a kind of, it's not actually based exclusively on what could be called a plane or a dimension of reality. It's actually a state of consciousness and being that arises as we cultivate the experience of understanding what transcends all of those levels, all of those ways of being. So intuition can be fully realized in relationship to the physical world or the emotional world or the mental world. And not because we're bringing it down per se through other levels, but because it's the actual inner nature of each of those levels. So I just want to throw that out briefly because it helps to kind of define a little bit more what I mean by intuition. That's a little more universal than most of the definitions that one might encounter. So it has something in common with, I think, a lot of the ways that intuition is used, which is it's sort of a spiritual way of being. It's a spiritual way of knowing. But it's probably my specific way of defining it is a little bit different than most others. Sometimes very different if it's kind of along the lines of saying it's psychic sensitivity or it's a instinctual hunch or something like that. So we'll come back to that more. That's just a kind of a brief hit. In a sense, intuition, understanding and experiencing intuition is very much at the heart of all that we'll be talking about. And every practice that we'll explore is a way to develop, to access intuition and to express intuition. So let's take an example of that. One of the most common ways to access intuition is to cultivate spiritual qualities, because spiritual qualities are really just ways of describing the development of intuition. They're facets of intuition. For instance, we might think that a quality like peace or detachment is almost like a principle, something like a tool, like, or in the case of peace, it's sort of like a feeling, a vibration that we can invoke, we can cultivate. But really, to more deeply experience and understand peace, it's actually a state of consciousness. There is wisdom inherent in peace. Peace is a type of wisdom. It's also both a means to wisdom and it's a byproduct of wisdom. So in these spiritual qualities, there's always intuitive wisdom. And in fact, you could say that when we talk about spiritual qualities, we're really just talking about different facets of intuition. One of the most important facets, of course, is awareness, and all the different words that kind of relate to awareness. Awareness is such a fundamental part of human experience, and it's such an essential and universal spiritual quality that it's particularly powerful to understand awareness as a doorway to cultivating intuition. During the course of our talk about spiritual practice over the weeks, we'll look at other qualities too, other practices, and specific, more concrete, specific methods too, in situations. So for instance, if one is engaged in a practice that's vision-centered, as a practice we'll talk about at some length, that I usually just call gazing. Now in gazing meditation, you can keep your eyes open or you can keep them closed, but instead of, say, reciting a mantra or following the breath or visualizing an image, a mandala or a geometric symbol, or all these different. In gazing meditation, it's very simple. You simply focus in the experience of being aware of looking. And you can do it either internally or with your eyes open. sometimes people like to do it in nature. You go outside and you pick a scene and you just gaze into that scene and you cultivate qualities like being at peace, being equanimous, being content, being concentrated, and so on. The classic, it's like any other form of meditation. So in using this as an example, I bring it up because in that particular meditation, there's at least two simple things that are going on. One is that there's a specific form to the meditation. In this case, it's gazing. You simply look. You don't try to see anything in particular. If something arises, let's say if your eyes are closed and you're gazing and you see an image of a figure, or maybe you see luminosity, maybe you see geometric symbols, or maybe you just see darkness. All of those are common experiences. Probably the most common for a long time is to just see darkness, because that's what most people will see if they close their eyes. And even if you sit and continue to gaze in a meditative way into the space in front of you, it's likely you'll continue to just see darkness most of the time for a while. So that's the form of the meditation, you might say, is gazing. But the quality of the meditation can vary depending on where you put the emphasis. You might gaze with a sense of alert, curious investigation, wondering what will happen in a kind of detached but curious way. Or you might gaze with a quality of devotion and faith, that there is a divine reality sort of veiled from you that's there to be not only visually seen, but ultimately merged with, and that you sit in a kind of devotional faith that that reality is there, and you can open to it just by gazing. You might gaze in a spirit of blessing and loving kindness, or in a spirit of deep peace and contentment. So each of these meditations actually can be quite different in the way it feels, although the form of the meditation is identical. You're gazing. So the doorway we're going to emphasize right now more is awareness, because although it's not the only quality that's important to cultivate in our spiritual life, it's a very profound quality, a very central one. And in fact, it's essential to every spiritual practice. The form may vary. We can describe dozens or hundreds of different spiritual practices, some that are more active, that involve breathing practices or recitations of mantras, or even engaging in movements like in Tai Chi or Hatha Yoga. But regardless of all this enormous diversity, there's always a need to be aware. There's always a need to be present and concentrated. There's always a need to cultivate some equanimity and some peace. So these qualities are both what we seek to bring to the practice, as well as what are the byproducts of the practice. Each of these qualities will deepen as we engage in a spiritual practice. So because awareness is one of the most important qualities, the most central qualities, because there's qualities that you could think about, like humility. Humility is a powerful quality to cultivate in a spiritual practice. Many practices don't make any reference to humility, though. It's quite possible to go about a particular practice without particular awareness of or intention to cultivate humility. Humility, if the practice is pursued in a balanced way, if it's an authentic spiritual practice, humility will probably be a byproduct of that practice over time. But you don't necessarily have to think about it. But awareness is one of those qualities you do kind of need to have at least some mindfulness of. Like it's so basic that it's difficult to engage in a practice without being aware that you're conscious of what you're doing. It's integral to the experience of being intentional, of sitting down with some intention. You have awareness of what your intention is. You have awareness of what the object of the practice is. The specific, let's say you're meditating on a mantra, then there's awareness of the mantra. So even though it kind of seems like awareness is sort of not only universal, but it's kind of obvious, I'd like to push beyond the obvious nature of awareness and talk about it a little more closely for a minute because of how profound it is. There's some practices where awareness is the primary quality that's emphasized, even more than concentration. Certainly often more than other qualities like love or contentment. It's not as though those qualities won't develop in that context. They won't blossom in that context. It's more that usually we find, if we look closely at any given spiritual practice, there's a kind of a cluster of qualities that are the ones that are being most emphasized in that practice. In the Buddhist tradition, there's some core practices. I think the Buddha originally described this primary practice as vipassana or vipassana vipassana in Sanskrit. And it's kind of evolved into having other names in other forms of Buddhism, like Zazen in the Zen tradition, and other terms. The nature of this practice is that although other qualities are an important part of the practice, awareness is perhaps the most fundamental quality. For this reason, I sometimes just call these forms of practice awareness practice. In fact, so central is awareness to these forms of practice that there's a form of them where you don't even particularly focus on a particular object of meditation, such as the breath or a mantra or a visualization. You simply cultivate an awareness of whatever is arising, and not just in a particular area like vision or sensation. It can be thoughts or memories, it could be visionary experiences, it could be energetic phenomena. Any dimension, physical, psychological, or spiritual, is equally available to your awareness. You're not being selective at all. And you focus on being, so that the practice is to be, in a sense, concentrated on being uniformly aware in a relaxed and spacious way of whatever wants to arise of its own accord. So if in one moment you hear a car go by, then you notice that in a calm but very alert and mindful way. And in the next moment, if you feel an itch on your leg, then that's what you're aware of. And your mind develops this ability to just allow in a very spacious way anything to come in to your awareness that wants to. This is kind of in a sense, you could say, the ultimate form of the cultivation of awareness, because it brings that quality to the forefront and you become deeply immersed in simply being aware of whatever's there. This is a particularly profound way to develop intuition, because if you move away from the type of ordinary awareness that we have, which is a kind that kind of jumps from one thing to another in a way where we get kind of lost in it. Let's say the phone rings, you notice that, we go over and we answer the phone. We hear the person's voice and we pay attention to that in a way that's not usually conscious. All of this is basically kind of habit-driven and desire-driven, whatever whatever's going on in our environment and whatever particular reactions we have kind of dictates where our attention goes. And there's really no intentionality there. And there's no kind of, there's no equanimity and awareness around the whole process. We're kind of in the flow of it all, caught up in it and reactive. And so part of the key to the unfoldment of intuitive presence and wisdom is that when that awareness starts to take the form of becoming more spacious and more equanimous, and more mindful of taking this position of a kind of calm wakefulness, of being present to what's happening without getting caught up in it. This allows a kind of another layer of reality to start to surface. It's as if there are deeper, subtler things that are going on in life and in our ordinary day-to-day experience that we're simply not noticing because we're kind of riding on the surface of things. We're caught up in the moment-to-moment experience of phenomena, desire. I feel hungry, I get up, I go to the kitchen, I look for what there is to eat. This is life for us. We're, oh, it's time to go to work, I better take a shower. And what we mean by awareness in this context is the cultivation of, in a sense, a part of us that opens to a larger context and is noticing and is aware, is mindful that these things are going on. And at the same time, and part of what we can mean by mindfulness here is a intention to stay awake in the midst of all this activity and experience, to not, one good analogy I think that we've all experienced is if we are sitting and say watching a movie, all of us I'm sure have noticed that there are times when we kind of get swept away in the movie, and then there's other times where we're aware that we're watching a movie. We might still be engaged in the movie, but we have a contextual awareness at the same time that this is a movie. In a sense, that's part of the key of mindfulness or awareness practices, that there's a conscious experience of holding context, of being awake in the midst of that activity, so that instead of just being completely absorbed in the flow in an instinctual and kind of unconscious way, we're awake. Now, if we cultivate this quality in a meditative context, something very powerful begins to happen, which is that awareness is kind of like to use this sort of obvious metaphor, it's a quality of light. So if we cultivate the intention of strengthening that light by being aware, being present, and just cultivating, noticing whatever's happening in the moment, well, that essentially means that the light of awareness is getting brighter. And it results in us noticing things that we didn't notice before. There's a layer, what we discover is that there is depth to life, into ordinary experience, and that we're kind of living on the surface of that depth. And if we slow down our internal processes, especially say during meditation, which makes it easier to cultivate these qualities, if we strengthen the quality of our presence and our awareness, then that awareness starts to sort of creep into places that it hadn't been before. We notice things that we weren't noticing before. And as that awareness deepens, especially as it's coupled with other qualities like equanimity and peace and concentration, all these qualities sort of reinforce each other. There's really no substantial expansion moment to moment of our awareness without our awareness also becoming more quantumous. And as our awareness becomes more quantumous, it becomes more peaceful. And as awareness becomes more quantumous and peaceful, it becomes more concentrated. We penetrate more deeply into the experience that's arising. And all of these qualities are part of what leads to a deepening of understanding, of intuition, because awareness is now growing and it's penetrating more deeply into experience. It's less on the surface and more into the soul of what's happening in front of us, you might say, the deeper realities. So awareness has this remarkable quality of being able to, simply through the intention to be more conscious moment to moment, the veils that are there before our eyes, so to speak, before our, the veils over our day-to-day experience gradually dissolve or are lifted, and we just start to become conscious of things that we weren't before. There's a funny way in which, on the spiritual path, we might hear of all kinds of things, especially the most, transcendental or miraculous. We hear about states with names like God consciousness or nirvana or Kundalini phenomena and other planes and chakras opening and all types of phenomena like this. From the point of view of awareness, there's nothing special that needs to happen for all of this to come within our experience. All we need to do is cultivate awareness. It's all there already. The reason that we're not experiencing it is that our consciousness is restricted. And we can reverse that process and unrestrict it so that it starts to expand out and all those veils become lifted and all of these realities become revealed to us, including, most importantly, a fundamental awareness of the truth that all things are intrinsically interrelated already and always were, and that we simply need to awaken to that reality. And we can awaken to that reality simply by expanding our awareness, because then our awareness will see the truth. It'll see what's already there. So one question we might ask then is, how come that's not happening already? Why is our awareness restricted? How come we don't just see these truths? Because to intuition, to a kind of intuitive awareness, all these realities are self-evident. It's just the way things are, and we see it clearly. So why isn't that happening already? Well, there's sort of two levels to a response to that question. One is a more kind of absolute answer, of like the deepest version. Like, well, how did, that's ultimately the same as, how did all this get started? But we're going to be a little more practical, and I want to talk on a kind of more psychological level, you might say, like, what is the mechanism of that restriction? Well, there's a few different ways of looking at it that I think are particularly powerful, but perhaps one of the most easy to experience, most obvious to our awareness is that in our current state of consciousness, we have preferences. There are things that can arise in our experience that we would rather not be experiencing. And there's other things that can arise in our experience that we not only prefer, but we also hope will stay around once they've arisen in our experience. And when they're not around, we put energy into hoping that they'll be around, that they'll come into our experience. This basic dynamic of having preferences, of having judgments, of having things that we like and things that we don't like, things we're attached to and things we're averse to, actually constricts our consciousness, because it essentially means when some type of phenomena are arising, I'm gonna open to that, and when other things arise, I'm gonna close off to that. And that's awareness. That's essentially what we're either opening or closing to. And even when we open our awareness to something that we think is positive, from our in terms of our values, what we want, what we like, the way that we're opening to it isn't actually in a kind of fresh, spacious, accepting manner. It's with an agenda. This is something I like. Oh, I'm so happy that this is happening. I hope I don't lose it. I hope it stays around. All of this is also still a constricted state. It's fearful. It's tense. Because even in a moment of joy, hidden in the background is, oh, how long is this going to last? What could happen in my life where I could lose it? Last time this happened, I lost it. All of that's tainting it and restricting it. So essentially, there's just a fundamental reality to our human experience, which is that we relate to life in terms of filtering everything that we experience and that we do through this lens of our preferences. And to the degree that we do that, to that degree, our consciousness is restricted. So this is one way to define what in some of the Asian traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism is called samsara. Samsara is not a realm quite in its most essential reality. It's really a state of consciousness. One way to describe it is it's this modality I was just describing of operating with preferences. So the way to intuitive experience, the way to the blossoming of spiritual qualities, the blossoming of a deeper sense of communion and interdependence, blossoming of a more profound understanding of reality, and ultimately nirvana or liberation from suffering, is to cultivate what it effectively is a 180-degree reversal, an exact reversal of the modality of seeking to cultivate preferences and to pursue preferences. We're going to literally bring a 180-degree reversal and say, I believe that there is a fundamental reality to life and myself that I can open to that is the most satisfying reality to know, and that I will know it by being open to all experience and not judging anything, not preferring one type of experience over another. If there's any experience that I'm going to prefer at this point, it's going to be that I'm going to prefer to not prefer anymore. And this leads to an expansion of awareness. This leads to a whole new way of experiencing, where instead of being in a state where our awareness is really a slave to what we want, and we direct our attention towards what we're trying to get, and we try to withdraw our attention from what we don't like. At the heart of this too is the experience of happiness and pain or sorrow or suffering. We're trying to get away from what we think is causing sorrow, and we're trying to explore, to control, to embrace, or to pursue what we think will make us happy. If we shift that understanding to just a general openness to life as it is, without preferences, then a deeper understanding of reality and our own nature is revealed, because our awareness just naturally starts to explore, just expand. And in that expansion, we realize things, because inherent in the very nature of awareness is intuitive knowing. Deep down, the nature of awareness is it just knows things. So if awareness expands, our realization expands. So enlightenment isn't really something outside of ourselves, like it's something over there that we need to go find. It's inside of our very nature right now. It's our deepest nature to be enlightened. And it's only the restrictions in our awareness that cause us to not experience that. So if we cultivate a more present-centered, relaxed, spacious, kind, and equanimous awareness, our realization of that truth will just naturally come to the surface. It's just a matter of time. Because we have to kind of let go of we have a lot of habits of, lifetimes of cultivating preferences. So once we start to turn that around and decide to say, okay, I'm going to embrace life in its totality. I'm not going to break it up into parts and push some parts away and embrace other parts. Then we have to kind of let go of all the habits, this centuries of doing the opposite, centuries of cultivating desires and aversions. So it takes time for those to kind of gradually fall away and for us to kind of arrive back in the moment of just being with reality as it is, completely, moment to moment. And that profound state of embracing just the truth, reality, the wholeness of life, is the natural and inevitable outcome of simply letting our awareness expand by opening moment to moment in this way, by cultivating an equanimous, spacious awareness. Now, awareness will also reveal all kinds of other things along the way, some of which are kind of just incidental things that we don't really need to take much notice of. But other things, ultimately, although we don't want to become attached to them, they may end up being things that are understandings that can have value, and even awareness of realities. Let's say, for instance, if we simply are cultivating awareness in the ways that I've been describing, for instance, and there's lots of ways to nurture that development. So we're gonna go into the details more as we go. But as that essential experience of growing awareness unfolds, it ultimately becomes an increasingly intuitive awareness naturally, just by the falling away of our preferences, our desires, our aversions. This intuitive awareness will naturally grow. And for instance, one of the things that we'll start to become more sensitive to is prana, or energy. We'll notice that in our physical bodies, there are finer experiences, finer vibrations, finer currents moving, energy centers, chakras. Now, we can do very specific practices to try to cultivate that awareness. But even if we don't do that, even if we simply are cultivating awareness in a more universal way, awareness will work its way into those areas and lift those veils, and we'll become aware of these subtler realities in our bodies, these chakras and meridians and pranic movements of energy. We'll even discern finer subdivisions within them of ways that these different vibrations, this prana or chi, moves in our body and the different functions it has. And the nature of intuition is we don't need to study books to understand this. We don't need to investigate in a scientific way. Anything that can be known to science can be known through intuitive understanding, but it's a different methodology. It doesn't go about a process of kind of moving back and forth between sensory experience and experimental activity, and then model building and comparing the model to the data, and kind of a feedback loop of going out to physical experience and then back to the model, and trying to refine both in that process and come to more knowledge, the same kinds of things that science is discovering about the world can be known through intuition directly. And in fact, better. It's possible through deep intuitive development, for instance, to develop such a clarity of intuition that we can go into any phenomena, let's say a plant, and not only commune with its soul, with the underlying intelligence and presence that is the nature of the plant, and know it in a profoundly intuitive way in its essence. We can even go into all the cellular level and the chemical processes and all of that, and understand that too with our intuition, if we decide, if we want to. So we can study diseases in that way. We can study the cosmos. We can study psychology in that way. There's nothing that we can't know about the universe there's nothing that we can't know with intuition in this way. And often in a more detailed and precise way. Because there's things like, for instance, right now in physics, there's theories about trying to figure out how all this works that are now speculating about things like other dimensions, 9 and 11 dimensions. But the physicists are now at a certain point of a challenge about some of these theories, like string theory, because there's no way that they have any idea about at this point of how to test whether a string really exists. It's so tiny. It's extraordinarily small. It's like, many, many orders smaller than an atom or a subatomic particle. There's no way to see that. They want to know, like, what's on the other side of it. Is it possible that on the other side of a black hole, there's a doorway into a parallel dimension or a parallel universe? Intuition can explore these things. Modern science is running into barriers where it just can't. It doesn't know if it'll ever know if there's higher dimensions, or there's strings, or there's alternate realities. But intuition has no boundaries around these things. People often tend to imagine that intuition is kind of this kind of mystical, foggy oneness quality, where it's kind of this sweet thing, but it's not very grounded and it's not very connected to the world, and it's kind of things it can know are sort of more spacey and ungrounded and spiritual and mystical. Well, some people use their intuition in that way. If they have limited intuitive development and they're not the kind of person that's terribly grounded, or then sure, it can come out in that way, but it's not a full development or a balanced expression of intuition. But in the complete development of intuition, intuition expresses boundless love and compassion and bliss. It's a tremendously warm and nurturing and profoundly loving quality. It's also opens to a deep sense of calm and peace, tranquility and contentment. But it's also luminously insightful, and people, I predict that 1,000, 2,000 years from now, we'll see thousands of people who will be pursuing things like what is currently called science, but they'll be using intuition instead. And we'll be able to understand much more about reality than we currently can through science. Science has made a lot of contributions and has value, but the method of knowing used by science is still rooted in too much dualism. There's not enough intuitive clarity and wholeness in that understanding. So it can neither penetrate to the deepest cores and universal truths of reality, nor can it actually plumb out the finest details, ironically. And of course, what's wonderful and profound about intuition is that it transforms the intuitive at the same time as it reveals new understanding. So if you're like an intuitive scientist, it's a spiritual path for you, because not only are you participating in some project to bring greater understanding about life, you are transformed in the process of your investigations. So at the moment, I'm kind of emphasizing awareness and also kind of like the way it can be, intuition can be used to understand reality. That's kind of the knowledge, wisdom, insight aspect of it. But keeping in mind, and we're going to talk about this, certainly more as we go along. It's all, intuition has all of these aspects to it, and devotion and surrender and love and kindness are all part of intuitive development as well too. People do tend to specialize those. In any given tradition, you may see a kind of leaning one way or another. But part of what's, to me, the developing spiritual sensibility in the world today is a more unifying understanding, of a broader, richer understanding of how all of these practices and qualities and approaches and points of view are part of a more complete understanding of a kind of complete human spirituality. Well, why don't we take a moment now to do a meditation. Let's take a moment to settle in. And immediately notice that in intending to meditate and turning your attention within, you have to do that with a measure of awareness. And that very intention kind of heightens your awareness a little bit. You're a little bit more fully present. As part of strengthening your awareness in this moment, notice your physical body more. Relaxing your body. And taking an inventory. Scanning through your body. Notice any places that there's any sensations of any sort. Maybe tension or discomfort. There might be positive feelings. Might be a feeling of peacefulness or agitation. Whatever is there, try to just notice it in a calm and accepting way. And also bring within your awareness other sensations. You can hear my voice. Other sounds, you may hear the sound of your breath. You may hear traffic or noises in the living space that you're in. You may notice any internal sounds. Maybe there's some inner dialogue or that voice that talks in our minds. Sometimes we might hear subtle sounds or although your eyes are closed, there's still potential for visual experience. You can be mindful of what's before your inner eye. You might see primarily darkness. Or other things, images might come and go occasionally. Just let all that be, but be present to whatever's there. Sensations in the body, temperature, pressure, discomfort, pleasant qualities, sounds, sight. Now, if you've identified any discomfort, whether it's an annoying sound or discomfort in your body, take a moment to be more present to that particular sensation. If there's anything unpleasant, just investigate that for a moment. Explore being a detached observer, just noticing the unpleasant sensation. Be mindful if there's some part of you that would like that to go away. That has the impulse to either try to fix it or ignore it. Just notice that and accept that too. Now bring your awareness to your breath, as particularly the sensation of your abdomen moving as you breathe. Just pay attention to those sensations. In your peripheral awareness, you might be aware of other sensations in your body, thoughts, emotions, and sounds in your environment. You can just let all that be there, not trying to get rid of that. Just let it be, but keep your attention a little more focused on the breath. You may notice other feelings arise as you calmly focus on the breath. Sometimes becoming distracted, and then you just gently bringing the attention back to the breath as soon as you notice. You may notice potentially distracting thoughts like judging how well you're doing, or feeling bored, impatient, or restless. These are just more things to notice that are arising. Just let them be too. Now turn your attention to feeling your body as a whole. Feeling the surface that you're resting on. To sensing the room around you. And then when you feel ready, open your eyes. Probably many people here are some familiarity with this form of meditation. It's a practice that's explored in one form or another in many different traditions. What's particularly profound and simple about a practice like this, particularly the aspect of, say, following the breath, is that it's a very direct way to cultivate intuition, because you're not engaged particularly in trying to accomplish anything per se. It's not a complicated visualization or a breathing practice. All of these can be powerful techniques too, but there's something very simple and essential about a pure presence practice like being with your body and your breath, because it's an opportunity for us to very essentially experience the reality of how our consciousness works. How do we react to the simplicity of just being with our breath? So an opportunity for deepening self-awareness and self-knowledge, especially intuitive self-awareness. It's very evident in a practice like that. Very accessible to us. Also, it's a very beautiful form of essentially tantric practice, because, as you remember, the essence of tantra, one of its key components is the union of opposites, the union of to use the Hindu terminology, Shiva and Shakti. Remember, one way to understand the essence of these two principles is that they're the essence of mind and body. The essence of body is form and energy, and the essence of mind is awareness, consciousness, and knowing. So if we link these two by bringing our awareness to our breath is a basic way that Shakti, that energy, that life force, is manifesting in our nature and in our experience. And so to simply open our awareness in a very simple, grounded way to communing and tuning with our breath is a profound moment of nurturing a marriage and integration between these two realities. As we enter into more deeply intuitive states, we will realize a profound interdependence between these, an inseparability. At this stage, it might seem like awareness is contemplating something external to itself, the breath. But by pursuing that practice in a way that is peaceful and spacious, non-judgmental, just a kind of open, accepting contemplation of the breath. An intuitive experience will gradually arise. And the mystery of the breath will be revealed as this universal presence within our experience of universal energy, a phenomenon, Shakti, if you will. So on the one hand, it might seem like a practice like this is very kind of basic or elementary or beginner's practice or whatever. But the seeds of the deepest states of realization are accessible in the most simple levels of experience. And everything that we want to know about ourselves that would lead to our liberation, our enlightenment, our self-realization is accessible through our own immediate experience of working with our own mind and body in this moment. So that's part of the beauty of this practice, is that's a very essential, simple, accessible way to open to these deepest realities through working with our experience as it is right now, and doing that in a way that allows consciousness to deepen and realization to deepen. Excuse me. So why don't we take a 10-minute break now? And then we'll continue. Okay. I'd like to make some space now to see if there's any questions. No?
Actually, yes, I do. I try to put it in on the chat, but it doesn't work. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. Actually, a brain scientist a long time ago told me that men could think of nothing, not in a meditation way, but in a normal state of mind. And it still puzzles me. Is it really true that men can think nothing? Because I can't. I can't have a brain. Do we really work that different? I mean, is this so big a difference on us?
I haven't talked to many men who could think of nothing very easily, though. So I'm not sure what he's talking about. That would be a good trick, you know, because very often people consider thinking of nothing as a type of meditation, you know, a kind of emptying of the mind. But in fact, most people that I've talked to, male or female, you know, find quieting the mind to be pretty challenging. So, yeah, I don't know what to make of that exactly, but it's not been my experience in relating to people that men are like that. Maybe he's referring to a kind of not thinking that's not necessarily truly not thinking. They just put things out of their mind that they don't want to think about more readily. That's all I can imagine that might mean. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I tend to often, when I do meditations on the breath, get into a dreamy state. But I'm aware, I've been meditating long enough now that I actually have like an ability to penetrate awareness of the dream a little bit. And it's a question I've had for a long time, whether or not that is just my mind trying to create content to distract me from the boredom, or if it's truly another realm or reality that I'm tuning into.
Now, would you say the dreamy quality? When you say, is that something, some content your mind's generating? Do you mean the dreamy?
Yeah, the dream content is there's people doing things, there's something happening, I'm aware of an agenda, something that's meaningful that's going on.
Yes, I see. Thanks, Lars, by the way. Yes, the recording is on. I'll double check though. Yep. It could be that it's something that your mind's generating. Did you say, is it possible that it's something your mind's generating as a distraction?
Yeah, I've contemplated that that's what's going on, that rather than having no content, my mind would rather fall into dream state and create content in that manner than have no content at all.
I see. That's a possibility. It's also possible that that particular meditation, because it's kind of more body connected, there's something about that meditation for you that kind of opens more of an awareness to a more kind of subconscious dimension of experience, kind of a dreamy, astral, and that it's not necessarily that some part of you is kind of escaping or attached to going there. It can be that it's just that happens to be what you're opening to, and that you find that a little bit harder to be mindful in that state than if it, some other form of meditation, for instance. So that's a possibility too. It's hard to say, more specifically what's causing that, what might be giving rise to it. But certainly there's a way in which the different parts of the body, the way there's, say, for instance, chakras in the different parts of the body, or even just a sort of mundane awareness of, we have more feelings kind of. So there's, in an ordinary sense, there's more consciousness for most people in the head. And then things become more feeling and subconscious as we go down in the body. So if we do a practice like following the breath that brings us to that area, it can sometimes be a kind of heavier meditation for some people and bring out either heavier physical sensations or subconscious energies or emotions, and then it can be sort of foggy. So one of the basic, this is a good question also in a larger context, because it brings to mind, the issue that different meditations do affect people differently. And so, for instance, some people don't respond well to this kind of meditation for a variety of reasons. Ultimately, it's something that anybody could learn to do well, so to speak. But it's common for people to find it challenging, some people, for one reason or another. One of the reasons can be this, what we're talking about is like a greater heaviness or unconsciousness or emotional, even psychic kind of opening, because that's often connected to the chakras in that area of the body. And a sort of remedy for that would be to bring awareness up into the head again. For instance, the gazing meditation I described earlier. In a sense, that can be a kind of mindfulness meditation too, where you're not trying to see anything in particular. You're just gazing. And but you're gazing in a conscious, concentrated, tranquil, accepting way of whatever's arising, and especially if nothing's arising, because that's where people are more likely to get caught, as they're wishing they could see something and nothing's happening. So you just keep looking no matter what. That, because it energizes more of the higher chakras, brings out qualities like concentration and alertness more, whereas being with, say, the breath at the abdomen can bring out more lethargic qualities sometimes, or heaviness, or dreamy states, or things like that. So that can be an antidote to that is to bring the energy up higher and focus it somewhere else, like in vision, or that. Sometimes another method of this meditation, the way it was taught, in the original forms of Buddhism, and is continued, still practiced that way, is to be mindful of the breath, but more as the sensation of the air going in and out of the nostrils. So that again brings you up into the head, and it's very likely you'd be less likely to have those kind of symptoms of. So all you do is just pay attention closely to the sensation of air as it moves in and out of the nose, especially right at the opening of the nostrils, and make that the focal point of concentration. You might, if you're interested in exploring that particular practice, you could try it that way and see if that works better.
Thank you.
Sure. I saw that Linda had a question. Or was it Linda?
No, it's Johnny. It's me. Well, I have a question about tiredness.
Yes.
Or I would call it it's like heaviness in the head.
In the head.
In the head, out through the eyes. I've been experiencing this ever since we started these meetings, on and off. Some meetings I almost slept through, and other meetings I was more awake. This meeting I was pretty much awake, but through the meditation, the start of the meditation, I was very much aware. And then you said something about focusing on unpleasant things. You didn't to experience that. And then I was trying to focus on this tiredness. And then I got very tired. And I couldn't focus on anything because I fell a little asleep, on and off. So the way I have normally look at tiredness, I've seen it in my life, it's a sort of resistance against the bigger consciousness, the bigger life. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Sure. Well, for starters, I think your assessment of the situation is accurate. And it's part of a larger concept that we'll go into in greater depth later. But in addition to focusing on positive qualities like awareness or love or contentment, it's also important to recognize states of mind and qualities in our nature that are essentially obstructions to our awakening. And in most spiritual systems, there are kind of categories that have been developed to kind of help people identify those so they can be aware of them and work with them, find ways to skillfully work with those different obstructions. And some of the most classic versions are our attachments. To the degree that we're attached will be obstructed. And say, for instance, if we're trying to just be present in a peaceful and awake way in the moment, but we have a strong attachment to, say, making money. Let's say we're just very determined to be wealthy. Then a lot of people I've talked to about the meditation practice, they have a hard time not thinking about work when they're meditating. It could be because of their attachment to making money. It could be just their fear of failure, fear of losing their job, fear of losing a client, whatever the issue is. there's always some attachment. It's not as though these concerns aren't valid, at least some of them. But if we have excessive attachment there, then that will, if we're trying to do something else in life, mind is constantly pulled towards that. So different kinds of desires and attachments ultimately can become an obstruction to a more liberated, more present, intuitive, more soulful state of consciousness. Aversions are, sort of the flip side of that, aversion to anything. These two are very essential. A lot of the other ones are just variations on those two. But in terms of the symptoms of how they show up, other ones that are useful to identify, other obstructions or hindrances, as they're sometimes called, would include restlessness, boredom. Now, we can explore these and understand that, boredom is obviously sort of an emotion in a sense that's related to being attached to something happening, something interesting. So if we perceive or we believe that that's not happening, we're bored. Another very essential one is ignorance. Ignorance is an obstruction, just thoughts in our mind and in our essential understanding of reality that aren't true. But another classic kind of group of obstructive experiences, there's an interesting phrase in the Buddhist tradition, they're sometimes called sloth and torpor. And these words essentially mean heaviness, dullness, thickness, and tiredness. And they will, every meditator invariably has to deal with these qualities. They're going to come up, and sometimes people can get to stages where they're quite adept at meditation. They've been doing it for years, and then suddenly they hit a period where they're just tired all the time, can barely meditate without their head dropping, and it's almost like gravity pulling you down, like you can't resist just falling asleep, or or feeling like you can't even sit up straight, or whatever. There's various reasons for these qualities, these energies to arise. Two of the most common is that they're simply the feeling quality of heavier energies that are coming up out of the subconscious and need to be transformed. But as they come out, they have this sensation of kind of being obstructive and heavy and tired, and causing tiredness or thickness and these kind of things. So that's kind of a basic element. But another aspect is that it can also be an expression of a part that doesn't want to be experiencing whatever's happening in that moment. So it's a way of shutting down awareness. So this can be an actual motivation behind it. It's being used as a tool to get in the way. Ram Dass tells a funny story of, actually it was told by another fellow, maybe a well-known transpersonal psychologist, Ben Wellwood. Said he went to a talk by Ram Dass, 30 years ago, it was like in San Francisco. And Ram Dass was talking about spirituality naturally. And he was talking about the chakras, and he started to talk about the different states of consciousness associated with each chakra. And the person telling the story said that as he got up to the middle chakras, like the heart and above, he fell asleep. And then he woke up, sometime later, doesn't remember how, and the talk was over, and about a third of the audience was asleep, and the other third had already left because the talk was over. So as the subject moved more into more overt spiritual concepts, about a third of the audience just checked out at that point. So that, I think, is more in line with the quality of just kind of obstructing, like some part that's throwing up a resistance to opening to something specifically. And we see that a lot too. I remember when I used to teach back in the Boston area, it was inevitable that, if there's maybe 70 people there, 5 or 10 people were probably going to fall asleep in the middle of a meditation or a talk, and And in talking to some of them afterwards, it was invariably that they were feeling something was getting stirred up, or there was, So it can be that, or it also can just be generally opening to heavier karma, if you will, heavier psychological energies. I find that generally medium to heavy emotions, as they come up out of the subconscious during spiritual practice, tend to have a sensation about them of being thicker. And if they're coming up more strongly than normal in ordinary life, one of the side effects is you can either feel at least thickness and a sense of, sort of heaviness and thickness, if not actual tiredness and, culminating in falling asleep. Dealing with, there are skillful means, you might say, ways to work with all these different hindrances. And there's certain techniques and qualities, Jack Kornfield talks about how he went through a phase in Asia of having a lot of tiredness in his meditations. And this is after extensive practice, so he wasn't a beginner at that point. Still, the tiredness got very intense. Eventually, his teacher had him do his meditations sitting on the edge of a well. So he fell asleep, he was going to get wet. And that added motivation to stay awake. But there's less drastic methods for doing that. Sometimes breathing more deeply. Sometimes just getting up and moving around. Like if you're trying to do a meditation practice and you're tired, or there's a lot of thickness, just taking 5 minutes to get up and walk around. Sometimes a fuller, deeper breath. But I think a very important method is to make your peace with those energies. Like it's as if they kind of come up from behind and catch you off guard, they can pull you under. But if you kind of turn around and face them, so to speak, spiritually speaking, and just be aware of them, make them the meditation. There's sort of a spiritual principle or meditative spiritual practice principle I call the elephant in the room principle. I don't know if people are familiar with that phrase, but in our part of the world, this concept of the elephant in the room, it means if there's something very big that's in the room, but everybody's trying to ignore it. You can't really ignore an elephant in the room, but you can try. But if there's an elephant in the room, you probably should be paying attention to that, because that's the thing that's right there. That's the most dramatic thing that's in. So when you're meditating, let's say one's trying to follow the breath, or one's doing a gazing meditation or saying a mantra, and then something starts happening that's pretty substantial in one's experience, like feeling very tired. That's the elephant in the room. That's now the thing that needs to be addressed. And one of the most simple and profound ways to do that is to simply make that the meditation now. Turn your attention to that object, in this case, the tiredness, say, the heaviness. Now, that's a tricky way to go too, because another principle is that whatever you turn your attention to will become more evident in your awareness, at least sometimes, or at least initially. Things that are arising from our subconscious when we're meditating, that's a natural part of meditation. We can't really avoid that. In fact, it's welcome ultimately. These things are being released, they're being purified, they're being liberated. So we want things to come up out of the subconscious and be freed. But awareness that is present and accepting accelerates the rate at which things come up. So if the tiredness is substantial, and then we turn our attention to it, it can get worse before it gets better, and we might just succumb to it. So that technique doesn't always work either. But I would say it's the first place to go. The first step would be mindful of the tiredness and just make that the meditation. See if you can find a way to kind of make it interesting. Like, what is this? I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to be an objective observer and just use my awareness to kind of be present to what is this all about? Are there emotions behind it, for instance? sometimes you can find a way to kind of tease out if there's some kind of emotional content to the feelings. And so if that can work, you might use something like some deep breathing to bring more energy to see if that helps. If those things fail, I would just get up and go for a walk, for at least 5 minutes and see if that energizes things and shifts the energy. And then you can try again. During these talks, maybe that's, feel free if you, by the way, to move about a little bit, whatever you need to do to stay awake if that helps. So does that help? Follow?
Yes, that was very helpful indeed. Especially the thing you said about in a period with heavy feelings that they will come up during meditation. That is, I have one of these periods now, so that makes sense.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, one comment related to this.
Yes.
I just started to think about, can you hear my voice properly?
I can, yes, thanks.
Okay. One comment on this, I started to think about this, I think, are they coming from the Vedanta, these tamas, rajas, and sattva, tamas, rajas, and sattva principles. Like this tamas is going to this dullness, and rajas is like, burning or lightning, so there is too much activity, and sattvic is like a clear situation. And what I started to think about was like how to, link them to the mathematics. So if you're familiar with the exponential decay or attenuation, I would say that that's like a tamasic situation. So you are going downwards that way. It's not linear, but it's exponential. It's like a curvature going down. And if you are in a rajasic mode, you are like pumping the energy up, and you start to oscillate more and more and more, and that's like an exponential growth. But when they are in a balance, that's in a sattvic mode. And when I studied physics, and most clearly it came out when I was teaching these things, and I started to wonder what's the mechanism when you have this exponential decay or exponential growth. That's some kind of imbalance on the system. You could say that in balanced system you have like two energy sources, and on that if you have that balance going on, the energy is flowing from one storage energy storage to another, and then backwards, and it's in a balance, like it's like a constant movement. But now if you are in a tamas or rajasic mode, the energy is flowing only, and that causes like this exponential movement in one or another direction. And I see the same in how our mind is working, like we have this way of going to the dullness, so going downwards, or it's too active, so jumping everywhere. But it's very difficult to find, the balance, so that it's like a clear oscillations going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Yeah, incidentally, okay. People were just making, I guess the noise, there was some kind of, I hope everybody was able to hear. Yeah, but thank you for contributing that. That makes sense to me too. Sorry?
They say, they say hello. Yeah.
Yes, did you have a question or something? I guess not. Okay.
You must remember to take off the headphones.
Oh, yes? Does that cause a problem?
When we ask questions, one hears the noise from the headphones as you speak, Zachary. So I couldn't hear what you said because the noise from the headphones around your neck. You understand?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I
We must
understand.
remember to take them off when we talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's not that is the problem. It's somebody, one of us has the volume very loud, and so when your device, your computer or tablet is not muted, then there will be feedback. So what you hear will go into your microphone, and then we hear everything twice. And so somebody has a very loud setting. That's why.
Can you hear it now? Can you hear the feedback now?
No.
Okay. Okay, good. Maybe that's adjusted now. Thank you.
Is there room for a question more? One more question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'll go for another 25 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking you mentioned that when we do awareness practice, that we will discover the prana and the meridians and the energy centers in the body. Would you also say that when we do that kind of meditation, that we are enhancing prana and the etheric vitality in the body?
Very good question. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to make a quick comment first about becoming aware of prana and the chakras and so on. I want to make it clear that although all of these types of things that I mentioned as examples of what we can become aware of do invariably come to light in some way through expanding awareness, through something very essential like a practice of awareness. That many of these things do take time, so we won't necessarily set about to say spend a half an hour a day following our breath or doing some other variation on an awareness practice, and then 6 months or a year down the road we'll be aware of all our chakras. And it's invariably, it can take a lot longer. Some people that could happen, but most people it would take a while. And what does come into our awareness is often related to our history as well as the particular direction that we focus our awareness. So that, for instance, if we attune our awareness in an awareness practice more to, say, the emotional dimension of experience, that's where a lot of the growth in intuitive awareness will take place. And then, so one person may be experiencing a lot of awareness of energy and chi, chakras and things like that. And another person, it might be more kind of intuitive, philosophical in nature. And it depends on the person and also, but it's possible to develop a deep enough intuitive awareness that one can direct it in any direction one wants and accelerate the rate at which that area becomes much more, revealed to them. So that's just a comment about that part of it. So coming back, refresh my memory about what the point of the question was.
Yeah, okay. The essence was actually that you said that doing awareness meditation with the breath, that would make us more conscious of the prana and the meridians. So my question was then, will this awareness practice also enhance the etheric vitality or the prana in the body, actually doing that kind of practice?
Okay. Great, thanks, I remember now. Yeah, so the simple answer is yes. it will. But to go just a little bit more into that, one way of understanding prana is that it is the energetic expression of different states of consciousness. So, you know, we, from a kind of purely physical point of view, like say from the point of view of physics, we might just think of energy as some kind of, you know, like electricity, as something that's just a simple force, a kind of inert, or not inert, but like lacking in consciousness. It's just electricity or magnetism. It's just a mindless energy. But prana actually is not that kind of energy. It has consciousness in it. In fact, even the electricity does too, but it's so basic that it's hard for humans to relate to the quality of consciousness that's in ordinary electricity. So we just think of it as like a form of matter and energy. But actually there's consciousness there. Human prana, though, has even more consciousness in it. And so in consciousness and qualities like awareness and other qualities like contentment are part of that total field of consciousness energy. So if we strengthen any quality of presence, our prana will increase, our vitality in our body will increase. We might not immediately experience that. For instance, that increase of energy in our bodies might stir up subconscious feelings of, say, emotions or heaviness or things like that, energies that need to be. So the net result of a particular practice might happen to be that we feel more tired afterwards, or fatigued from the practice, but more, overall, the net effect of increasing consciousness, increasing qualities of presence, is that our vitality not only gets stronger, it also becomes more balanced as well. So, you know, for instance, many people are aware that you know, there's forms of healing that are energy-centered, where you know, whether it's Reiki or you know, other forms of use of etheric vitality or prana to enhance healing. So you can direct it that way. What's less well known is that these energies, these pranic energies, are also inseparable from the quality of our consciousness. So that if you do a practice like awareness practice, or any form of meditation really, where inevitably, through, as is inevitable with any spiritual practice, qualities are getting strengthened, like awareness and equanimity and contentment and love, these also build vitality in the body. And you can even, there's many anecdotes of people who have healed themselves from diseases, for instance. Diseases arise from imbalances and lack of vitality in the body. So if you bring your awareness to an area where there's disease, that will strengthen vitality in that part of the body. And it's possible, depending on your karma and just strength of your awareness and presence, it's possible to work through the karma behind that disease and heal it simply through awareness and the other qualities that are inherent in awareness. So yes, there's a very profound and a significant way that awareness and the other qualities of presence are directly, you know, connected to the vitality that we experience in the bodies. Any other questions? Well, while we're waiting for the possibility of more questions to arise, something I wanted to come back to is I had spoken earlier about that one of the most essential ways to understand spiritual development is to shift our style of being away from having preferences towards a more whole, equanimous, and contented state of consciousness. And a common reaction, and inevitable, I think understandable too, point of reaction to this idea is, well, if that's the case, how do we end up doing anything in life? Like, what would cause us to act at that point? If we had a perfectly equanimous and accepting state of consciousness, why would any behavior arise? For instance, how do we make choices in our lives? How do we engage? And briefly, I want to just comment that this is a very important kind of paradox, you might say, in spiritual understanding, because it would seem that having intention or desire or an aspiration or willpower or love, any of these things that kind of motivate us in a worldly sense or in a spiritual sense, are contradicted by the notion of transcending desire or being equanimous or overcoming preferences and discriminations of that sort. And this is really kind of more of a byproduct of the reality that any kind of description of enlightenment is invariably partial. So that, for instance, if we want to try to understand a more enlightened state of mind, and we come at it in any given moment, say from looking at a particular quality like surrender, for instance, or peace, that will throw a certain light on understanding what enlightenment means, both how to realize enlightenment and how enlightenment manifests in our experience. But any particular way of understanding or exploring enlightenment in that way, where we look at a particular principle or quality or understanding, invariably is partial, and it needs to be complemented with something else that gives us a more balanced understanding. And so this in a sense, one of these kind of more complementary pairs that help us see enlightenment in a more balanced way would be, say, on the one hand, qualities like detachment or acceptance or equanimity, and on the other hand, qualities like aspiration or love or intentionality. Both of these two sides are part of a balanced description of enlightenment, and it's really about integrating them that we come to this more balanced experience. So we'll touch in, that's actually a very significant theme, and one that my experience is there's a fair amount of confusion in the world, but in the spirituals, the general spiritual community in the world right now, there's a lot of confusion and struggle around this issue of how to view these different issues. So we'll keep touching back in on that one as we go. So a couple of quick chat questions. Someone asked if I had responded to make sure the microphones are on. Yes. Is it Sakari? Is that how you pronounce the name? Yeah, Sakari. Someone was asking if I'd answer your question. The impression I had was that you were sharing something more than a question. Was that correct? Okay. Then just wanted to make sure I didn't miss something there. And Hans Christian has a question.
Yeah, in terms of desire and in terms of tiredness, and I was wondering if you have been, or what your view is on parasites. You know, it's a huh?
Did you say parasites?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm talking intestines here,
Okay.
because there's some research that indicates that actually a lot of our desires comes from, you know, the wrong kind of diet and the wrong kind of eating. And so actually to have a successful spiritual practice, one even needs to eat the right kind of food, which actually energizes and nourishes the body, rather than food that is bringing the energy level down. It doesn't nourish the body, it's rather taking energy away from the body, because, you know, McDonald's burgers or whatever is not exactly the right food. So but rather it nourishes parasites, and those parasites, and this is the research apparently, that these parasites, they can actually, you know, take over a lot of the thinking we do. They can take over a lot of our choices we make, our desire choices, like what do we want to eat, and then we end up making all the wrong decisions about eating. And that in turn will make our meditation practice quite difficult and very heavy and very tiresome. And we will constantly be thinking about, you know, the refrigerator or something like that. Have you come across that, and what do you think about that?
Yes, I have, and it feels right to me. Yeah, in a certain sense, and that kind of leads to a far-ranging discussion of you know, where do desires come from in the first place, and are we the source of all of the consciously of the desires that we have, or do we pick them up not only psychically in the psychic atmosphere that we all live in, that we can sort of inherit desires from other people and from the general atmosphere of the world, which are in a sense a kind of parasites that kind of come into us and influence us. We kind of identify with them too, but also even physically, like, you know, science seems to be discovering. So that brings up a kind of important issue about how to work with all of these things. One way to frame a way to look at this issue is that there are, in a sense, two strategies, you might say, to whether we call it overcoming disease, overcoming suffering, attaining peace of mind, etc. One is to understand the essence, the deepest essence of the problem. And that could be conveyed as, say, ignorance, or a need for enlightenment, a need for self-realization. And secondarily, we can talk about, say, overcoming desires or aversions, judgments, etc., etc. The deepest truth, in my understanding, is that if one attains a very profound level of self-realization, the state of presence that generates, when it's integrated with the human personality and body, transforms the experience and the condition of personality and body in such a way that it becomes immune to disease. So that, in fact, a state will arise in the physical body where parasites won't be in harmony with that environment anymore, and they won't be able to exist there. So the ultimate cause of that hunger was ultimately not the parasites. They found a home there because of the karmic condition of the person. And if that karmic condition is worked out, they won't find a home there anymore. And then there's no need to avoid the McDonald's food because there'll be no interest in it, and etc. Now, the reality is, though, is that on the spiritual path, most people are not in this state of self-realization. So they do have these things like parasites and states of mind, desires, and so on. And many of them lead to unwholesome states. So that brings up a second type of practice. The first type is to work for that final solution, the state of realization, the state of being that ends disease, that ends desire, that ends suffering, that ends karma. But in the meantime, while we're working on that, we're going to have these conditions. We're going to have diseases, for instance. So, for instance, if I get a cold, or better still, if I get, say, an infection, I can tell myself, well, if I was in a deeply enlightened state, that would just get worked out. And so the ultimate remedy to this infection is self-realization. So that's what I'll work on. But I might be far enough away from self-realization that that's not going to work. It might. Even taking a step in that direction might be enough to work out that illness, and that will work. But more often than not, it's not time for that to be the direct remedy. That's the ultimate solution, and we work on that as the sort of like the thing that will work out all of these issues in the long run completely. But secondarily, there's no reason not to say, well, maybe I can use some herbs here. Now, the herbs aren't the final solution, but they could help my body feel more balanced, more healthy. They may strengthen my vitality. They may bring things that strengthen my immune system. I might even need to resort to antibiotics if necessary. None of these things are really addressing the actual cause. But there's no reason not to use them as methods to kind of just keep things in balance and push back against the karma a little bit, keep it from getting out of control so that we can continue on our path and feel healthier. And so, for instance, making changes in our diet, ultimately it's possible to enter a state of consciousness in which it ultimately actually doesn't matter what we eat. Our body's so filled with energy and consciousness that it'll all get transformed into luminosity, and there's no problem eating McDonald's if we wanted to. Normally we wouldn't want to. That impulse wouldn't be in there if we were enlightened. But we could. There was some reason that we wanted to take that in and transform it. We could. But for most people who aren't in that state, it's better not to eat McDonald's because it will reinforce obstructions in our consciousness and make it harder to become enlightened. So part of the path is using skillful methods to identify diet that's, in the case of McDonald's, it's not only healthier for us, it's to avoid that kind of food. It's ecologically better for the planet to avoid that food. So there's kind of several karmic implications that are better all around. All of that could be transformed if we were adequately enlightened, and we can kind of do what we want, if you will, in a more profound state. But to be more practical and grounded about the path, we're recognizing that generally people aren't there in that state of adequate self-realization where they can heal diseases, work out psychological issues, increase their vitality, maintain good health and strength and vitality in their body, balance out emotional issues, et cetera, et cetera. And given that most people aren't at a place where that's all being fully achieved through their spiritual practice, then other kinds of, that's why invariably every tradition has these kinds of guidelines, like try to eat like this, try to sleep like this, and regulate your life in these ways. And that's because it helps to achieve enlightenment more efficiently if we don't make things worse, don't increase our karmic burden, and we find skillful ways to work with the karma we already have and the side effects like disease and psychological issues and so on. So I think it's useful to understand the deep cause, but it's also important to accept it and to embrace the value of sort of secondary solutions that, yes, they work more with the symptoms. They don't as directly address the deep cause, but that's a perfectly valid thing to do and very helpful. And So in a sense, I strongly support that as well. Does that feel like it addresses the?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe it should be actually a modern part of the traditional path, the disciplinary path, that we actually educate the body to like the right kinds of nourishment.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know if you're familiar with a book you can find on the internet. It's called Biology of Kundalini. It's written by Jane Dixon. It's a very interesting book, where she's kind of going on it from the physical level, how Kundalini works when the biology is in the right state. That then the Kundalini and the awakening is a natural outcome. It's not even something you need to, work so hard at. It just comes spontaneously.
In a sense, you could say that there's two sides to two kind of key ways to approach spiritual development. One is to come at it more from the side of the mind and focus on the quality of realization. The other is to come at it more from the body. And there's a lot of aspects to the body approach. Foundationally, in a sense, part of what we would do is say, well, if mind and body were deeply in harmony, and one was in a state of self-realization, what would be our state of our experience? And also, what would our body look like? How would it feel? How would it function? What would we eat? How would we act? So one way to lean is, if we lean towards the realization, the inner side, we can seek to cultivate that state and then let the body just sort of naturally fall into what it's going to do as it becomes more enlightened. Another point of view, another approach, which I think is very powerful as part of a balanced path, is to say, well, if we look at more enlightened people and we generally find that they act, for instance, in these specific ways, why not use our willpower to kind of act that way ourselves, even though it's not natural for us yet to measure up to these specific guidelines, like a good diet. I'm going to do it anyway because it'll make my body feel better. My body and mind might not instinctually fully want to do that right now, but I can cultivate some wisdom that says, well, that is actually better for me. So even though somewhat part of me doesn't feel naturally drawn to it, I'm going to do it anyway, and I'll feel better. And actually, it'll bring more prana and more kundalini into my body to do that. Maybe my breath's off, so I'm going to train my breath to breathe like a more enlightened person would breathe, and that my kundalini will be even more active then. I will put things in my mind like mantras and positive thoughts, and I'll use my intentionality to act mentally in those ways, in spite of my tendency to think other ways. And because enlightened people tend to think that way, so I'm going to build that into my mind and my motivations and my lifestyle. And I've been engaged in this kind of work. So traditionally, people call this karma yoga, or following precepts, or the 10 Commandments or whatever. And I think, as you sort of Hans Christian were indicating earlier, my feeling is a new version of this is developing in the world now. That's because we have more knowledge from various traditions, from psychology to ecology to medicine and so on, that can help add additional pieces to what are wise and skillful ways to eat, to sleep, to work, to engage in the world, to even just to the macrocosmic level of how to even design a whole civilization. What's a sustainable, healthy, balanced. Excuse me. I think that's a very important and wonderful aspect of the path. Some people have a kind of preference to lean towards the other side and say, well, that'll all take care of itself. I'm just going to focus on the inner side more. And And that's fine. There's some dangers in that, but it can work. My feeling is it's best to do both. It's best to, integral path, be balanced, and because ultimately it'll not only be karmically preferable, we'll be healthier, we'll be happier, we'll put out better energy into the world, we'll live more in harmony with the planet, and so on. But it'll accelerate our evolution if we just emphasize one. It's like if we have two tools for enlightenment, a kind of action side and a consciousness side. And both of these tools can be used to accelerate our awakening. Why would we only use one? We might as well use both. So that's sort of a little bit of a pitch for a balanced approach. So, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, Hans Christian?
No, thanks. It was a very good answer. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, well, looks like it's about time to wind up. Thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.